Whenever we look back at the COVID crisis and lockdown situation that we've seen in this country, I think one point which will come to mind is the plight of lakhs and lakhs of migrant workers. Every day nearly we're besieged with pictures, stories, visuals of the plight of this large number of Indians. And today the top court also took notice. Now, while the court has taken suo motu cognizance of the plight of the migrant workers and the hearings will continue, some directions have been given today itself by the Supreme Court. Essentially, the Supreme Court has now mandated that migrants will not be charged by railway or bus fare. They have not gone into, how much center is charging, how much state is charging, whether they will be reimbursed. That's it. They will not be charged for any fare to go back home. States will provide food and shelter to stranded migrants until they make a way to travel. During the journey, the railways must provide food and the states will expedite the process of registration. This was the long and short of what the Supreme Court has said, but before this order came out, there was a very interesting courtroom drama, a back and forth between the Solicitor General and various other senior lawyers putting their views together. What it showed once again is how all of this has turned into a blame game between center and state, between railways and administration about whose fault this is. Can we now hope to actually find a way to alleviate the pain that so many of these people have suffered? To speak with me on this, I'm joined now by Ms. K. Sujatha Rao, former Health Secretary of India and someone who's been following the story also very closely. Ms. Rao, pleasure to speak with you on this show. Let me begin by just getting your take on the sheer numbers. Today we officially found out that 91 lakh people have already migrated, and some of the lawyers have claimed that there are 4 crore that are still waiting.
Well, no one really has the accurate numbers, as you know, because as per the law for informal workers, every district was required to register informal workers and migrants coming into their district and working. But that has never been enforced. It doesn't have any clear understanding, but the census data of 2011 is there, which gives you a fair idea of the state migration, and those figures may have been taken from there. So yes, it is a very huge humanitarian crisis that's facing us today, because despite the economy having started, most migrants want to go home, and I think it has become a psychological need for them to want to just go home. They'll come back again for sure, but they just want to go home. So I think we have to address that problem.
It's also highlighted the lack of coordination or how quickly it all falls apart when there is a crisis in place between center and state, between railways and a huge body like railways and various state governments, because as more and more incidents have come to light about the misfortune that these migrant workers have suffered, there's been a lot of finger pointing and blame game. Can we hope that there will be a smoother level of coordination and transition now that the Supreme Court has stepped in?
I'm glad that the Supreme Court has stepped in, because for once at least the policy clarity has emerged. Till now it was between the center and state, each one trying to abdicate their rights. So now that the Supreme Court has given a clear guideline, which is now binding on both the central government and the state government, they have to come to the working board and work it out. But I have to convey to you my deep disappointment at the complete application of the responsibility by both the central government and the state government on this issue of migration. I really don't understand what the blame game is all about. It's not anyone's responsibility. Migrants go up and down, and they come from one state, go to another state, they move to another state, and so on. So it's not as if, Karnataka can be held responsible for a lot of Biharis to come there and so on and so forth. So it should have been coordinated by the central government. And in my view, the central government has the resources. The problem here is the state governments have simply no liquidity. The financial status of the state governments is extremely poor. And as it is weak, and now it's being worsened because of the COVID, it was an external shock for them. They didn't expect COVID to happen. So to just keep on giving directives and asking the states to pick up the expenditure is an extraordinarily unrealistic expectation and in a sense a bit irresponsible, because if you ask me constitutionally, as per the Schedule 7 of the Constitution, epidemic and pandemic management is in the concurrent list, which means both the center and the state are equally responsible. It's just not the state's job alone. And that is how the central government is the one which really guided and directed and funded fully the polio eradication program, the HIV/AIDS program, the TB program, malaria program, all infectious diseases is in the central mandate, and they are the ones who really fund the entire program, and the states implement it. But I find it very strange today that the central government just pretends as if they're not at all accountable for the money that is included and involved in this whole exercise. So now that the Supreme Court has given these orders, I'm very hopeful that they'll work out the coordination part of it. And what I would like to really see is that they coordinate it in such a manner that no state is overwhelmed by a large number of trains, a large number of migrants coming all in a day, because every state has its own coping capacity. They need to test them, they need to screen the migrants. Today, you see, Kerala has 86 positives. You can't afford to, burden a state. It's not as if your just job is to dump a migrant over there in a state and say, I don't know what happens to the epidemic. Because the epidemic goes round. It starts somewhere, it can come to your state as well. So that coordination doesn't mean that states' permission is required, but you stagger the migrant flow in such a manner that it is in accordance with the coping capacity of the particular state. Until the trains move according to that plan, the whole state, has to keep the migrants and take care of them, which they're not. And that is the reason why migrants are walking and they get into these awful lorries, paying huge amounts of money for just a space to sit. Often they're hunched. I have been engaged with this migrants, putting them into buses for the last 10 days. And it's extremely inhuman conditions in which the migrants are getting buying space in these lorries, which are so unsafe and being transported. So I think the states have to own up responsibility and see that they go back home with dignity and professional.
Yeah. Ms. Rao, a couple of important points that you made, and one thing that came up in the hearings as well in terms of information of what's going on is that a large proportion of the people who are moving back to the states of UP and Bihar. Specifically. And now you talked about how these journeys have to be staggered. We're also seeing the other aspect of this is where COVID cases are naturally spiking as more and more people come in. Now, how do you balance that? Because the longer you take to send people back, the more, their frustration and pain increases, and then they start walking.
Yeah, but they start walking because they don't trust the government. We've talked to scores of these migrants. They don't trust the government to say that you won't extend you're saying one day that I'll have a train for you. The next day you suspend the train. Then you say that you have to go to the nearest police thana and register your name. They go there, they're asked to go to 10 police thanas. Then when they're registered, they find that people who are not registered people the place that they have to go to. So there's no systematic way of working out this fair and transparent. And no one knows which train goes when. For example, in Hyderabad, the trains have been suspended today. So, how do you know when it is suspended, when they're working, and so on? So I think if the systems are developed and if all district collectors are brought into the picture, right now the district collectors and magistrates are not into it at all, at least in Telangana state. And they're made responsible and accountable for transporting the migrants either by bus or by train.
Yes.
It's given to them. They do both the ways, whichever is easier to manage. But till then, they have marriage khanas, they have big halls at their disposal. They can look after them for that time. But if they don't give that security, naturally they'll start working because they don't trust the government anymore. So that must
No, so Ms. Rao, just give us some perspective. Just give us some perspective as someone who has worked, in government for so long. Don't we have the capability of coordinating such a huge event across various functions, across various departments? Do we or do we not have the capability of coordinating this? Or is this something which was bound to happen considering the size and scale of the tragedy?
No, I think it could be done. We have the capacity and the administrative competence and capability. You see how beautifully UP does at Kumbh Mela. A core of people go there and we don't have cholera outbreaks. So we have the capacity to organize. But for that, the central government should come up with very detailed, specific guidelines. You have to know what you want. The guidelines for an implementer at the district level have to have clarity. They have to have an objective which is very clearly spelled out. And what are the do's and the don'ts of it? Now, when there's no such clarity of the policy objective, then everything is left to discussion and each one it all to whatever they understand. So that's where I think we have failed in this operation. So I think while we have the capacity, the situation has snowballed into such a big humanitarian crisis that I'm really being persuaded today to think that maybe it might be useful to call in the army to restore some order and help the civilian authorities to plan the logistics out a bit fashion. It may not be too much of a bad idea because we do call the forces in to help us when we have natural calamities like be it cyclones or earthquakes. So this is no less a crisis. So it's not too bad an idea if we can have the forces with the discipline to help us.
All right, thank you so much for that. That was Ms. Sujatha Rao breaking down the crisis that we see. We can only hope that after what the Supreme Court has said, this is actually followed in letter and spirit by everyone involved, whether it is central government, state government, and all administrative departments. That's the very least that we can do.